You're listening to the Surgeons of Horror podcast.
We got special work to do here, you and me. You've got the body. I've got the brain.
Hello, welcome to the Surgeons of Horror podcast. Its purpose is to dissect horror films, both old and new. We're currently serving up the latest season dedicated to the late, great Wes Craven and his middle years, which we have dubbed the Nightmare Years. Basically starting with A Nightmare on Elm Street and ending on Wes Craven's New Nightmare and all that is sandwiched in between. We also thought, considering we're going to be talking about the Nightmare on Elm Street films that were directed by Wes Craven, we should probably talk about the actual franchise itself. We've started off with A Nightmare on Elm Street, and we talked about that one. And we're about to kick off the franchise discussions proper within this podcast with the sequel that followed that, which was called A Nightmare on Elm Street, Freddy's Revenge. Before we kind of start talking about that, though, let's introduce ourselves for the podcast team. There's myself, Saul Muerte, who is leading the discussions as always. And joining me for the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise discussions is Oscar Jack. Welcome aboard, Oscar.
Thank you very much, Saul. It's always a pleasure to be here.
It's great, man. It's really good. So you and I kicked this off for the Nightmare on Elm Street stuff with the original, and we discussed the impact that film had on both of us, and just us, but horror fans, the genre itself, and how much of a game changer it was at the time, and how instrumental it was to Wes Craven's career. And we're about to kind of kick off, as I said, with number 2, Freddy's Revenge. Before we do so, I asked this, as you know, to the podcast compadres that join me on these discussions. Do you remember when you first watched it at all and the impact that this one had on you at the time? Or are you new to this and you're watching it for the first time ahead of the podcast?
Oh, a little bit in between. I've actually watched this for the first time maybe 7 months ago for the first time.
Okay.
And I'd caught sort of most of the other Nightmare films around the same time.
Yeah.
I think they were playing on one of the Foxtel movie channels and going through them all periodically.
Yes.
And I always remember purposefully missing this one. Because I'd always heard it was the worst.
So you could avoid it.
I just it never kind of and after that it never kind of crossed my my bullseye. So getting to watch it for the first time earlier this year, as we're kind of coming into the retrospective, was great. It wasn't anything like I thought it was. And so interesting as the sequel. Yeah. Just looking at it, none of the others exist, only the first and this one. Yeah. It's really interesting. I'll hold off on on the rest of my thoughts.
Cool. Because they clearly go in a very different direction with it. And I guess we'll go into detail on this in a moment, but what I do mean by that, for those that if you haven't watched the film, is that primarily you go with a female lead that's being terrorized by the slasher, the slasher, or in this case, Freddy. And they deliberately chose to go with a male kind of figure that would be which would be our protagonist. And we'll go into more detail on that, as I said, as we nut through it. But so already it's a very different film when you deliberately choose to go that route. A very, very different beast. Yeah. And it's interesting that I'd be interested. Maybe I'll touch base. I'll ask this question when we get to the end of the chat. But like, what avenue you went through with this? Then, if the order you watched them in, and I guess the question, and you kind of hinted about it a bit just then, but more about if this was like the last one you watched of the franchise, then how did that impact you and your reaction to it based on what you'd seen from the rest of the franchise? So we'll put a pin on that and we'll ask you that as we get to the end. But yeah, as I said, very, very different thing entirely. Those that may be new to the podcast, if you're joining us for the first time, kind of general rule of thumb, not always, but general rule of thumb is that we kind of dissect the film itself by kind of looking at the plot line narrative, because it's kind of an easy way for us to follow that journey and discuss it. So that's kind of what we'll do in this instance in particular. As I said, I know in the past I've sometimes kind of just cherry picked moments. But I think we're kind of, in this case, because of the nature of this film, I think we'll stick to the plot line and we'll dissect from there. So with that in mind, let's take a look at what's happening. So we know from the original film that Freddy Krueger was apparently defeated, although there was hints of their dreamlike sequence where he comes back at the end in the car and he pulls the mother through the window. So there's hints that is he gone or not. And this was a deliberate play, as we said in our last podcast, by producer Bob Shea. And he definitely had an inkling in his mind about what he wanted to do and create, off the back of, the success that Nightmare on Elm Street had for New Line Cinema. He had a potential franchise on his hands. So, why not kind of delve into that? So Freddy does come back. I want to say he was also wrapped up in writing the script for someone else at the time. So he was kind of very heavily immersed in that, but he kind of gave them their blessing to kind of go off and make the film. But kind of, he always had the intention that it was always going to be, A Nightmare on Elm Street was a complete narrative on its own right, and had never envisaged Freddy. Like, Freddy was, in his mind, destroyed in the end of that film. So we do have Freddy returning in this film, obviously. But we pick up, before we kind of get any inkling of his return, we pick up with the family, the Walshes, who basically move into what was Nancy's former house. Home, so with the famous, red door on the outside. And we have this dream sequence that kind of opens up, which to me felt a little bit Beetlejuice-esque.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I definitely get the vibe. I think one of the things that which is so interesting, because we start off, we don't know it's a dream, but we figure it's probably a dream. We're seeing a Nightmare on Elm Street movie.
Yes.
There's only been one so far, but we know how it works. As they hop onto the bus and we just start on the bus coming down. We don't know who our protagonist is.
Yes.
We don't know who we're following in this moment. There's kind of people jumping off and hopping off, and then
that's right.
There's only 3 left. There's this kind of strange looking kind of emo child of the 80s, and these 2 kind of preppy girls.
Yes.
And we're focused kind of on them. They're the ones kind of talking the most.
Yes, that's right.
Whereas he's just the boy's just kind of,
it's kind of in a
wide-eyed.
Yeah.
He's just kind of looking, and there's something like, I think this movie is so funny. The image of the bus like speeding up. They go past the girl, stop. She's kind of freaking out. And then it just goes straight off the road into the desert and just is bumping along.
Yes.
It's just kind of, it's such like an absurd image of, massive wide shot with just the bus kind of bumping along. and then you get that that moment where it stops and the windows are locked, and you know they look out the window and see the ground just start falling away.
That's right.
And you know, until it's just the bus balanced on these like precarious stone pillars, and every move they make kind of unbalances it.
It was like
it's so crazy.
It was like a really warped version of the ending of Italian Job, wasn't it? Really, like you just want you want the strange emo kid guy to go, hold a minute, girls, I got an idea. But yeah, very very weird kind of stuff happening, wasn't it, in this instance?
Absurd, like I feel like kind of almost out of most of them, this has got like the biggest kind of dream imagery.
Yes.
Kind of how we think of dreams instead of like walking through school and following your dead friend. This has got like the crazy absurd images that like really like surrealist. There's so much drawn from surreal art and surreal images.
I agree. Yeah definitely. So like, and obviously like, you know, so I think the girls kind of get I'm trying to remember now from what happens to them, but he basically ends up waking up from the nightmare anyway. And then so at this point we go, oh right, so we're following emo kid. So his name's Jesse, and his room that he's sleeping in is like really really intensely hot. And so he's kind of woken up, and then we basically kind of like, we don't really get much insight into the family at this point. We know that there is it's the nuclear kind of family, essentially. He's got a sister and mum, dad scenario.
They're new. That we know that they're new. We quickly learn that, well, they're new-ish. The son, Jesse, hasn't fully unpacked his room, and they've kind of, the dad comments on that. I think it's like so many of the times when we cut to the family in the house, it's always shot with this like flat kind of wide angles, really kind of like overlit, like very sitcom. It just looks like we cut to a sitcom.
Yes.
And it's all happy, kind of like very picturesque nuclear family.
Yes.
And then a lot of the times when we're with Jesse, it's like, because I would say that lighting is like a fault of the movie, but it's clearly so purposeful.
Yeah.
Because you go from these like incredibly moody and dark and like kind of intense shots with Jesse to just like flat and big and blown out, and father and mother and little girl, and there's a lot of absurdity between like cutting between them a lot of the time.
Yeah, there really is, and you're really explaining the imagery of the film really well, Oscar. Thanks, and conveying that to the audience that's listening. But yeah, it's a very kind of and like, so when you compare that as well with Craven's original vision, like what I really loved about the original film is that kind of dream-like quality that kind of carries you through the entire film, that is almost translucent in its appearance, whereas this is a very different style that we're kind of confronted with. So basically, like we see that the nuclear family, as we said, and then we pick up with Jesse as he meets up with his friend Lisa, and it's hinted that he kind of likes her. But is that kind of awkward kind of thing around her where he kind of doesn't really know how to flirt with her, and then we get this moment where this is like in a lot of those kind of American college films, there's always like a sport kind of jock kind of thing, and he's kind of meant to be, I can't remember the sport. Is it baseball they're playing?
Baseball.
At this point. And then we have this kind of moment where he gets into a bit of a tangle with this guy called Grady.
Yes.
Yeah.
His best frenemy.
His best frenemy, yeah, which was weird because they like when we're introduced to them, you think they hate each other, and yet all of a sudden that switches really quite quickly to that they're like best buddies, and you're like, well, when did that kind of come? When did that happen? Yeah, and there's a bit where he the Grady guy Dax Jesse at one point as well, and they get into a scuffle essentially. Before the coach comes over and has to, separate them.
Yes, the coach who with a stick up his ass and who loves, who is Grady tells him he gets off on this sadistic, like making them do push-ups and running around. He's really into sadism. He even hangs out at an S&M bar.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's exactly right. So like so the coach is he's played by Marshall Bell, and he's kind of one of those people where you just go, I know his face. For me, he was always Total Recall, the original kind of Arnie film. And
who was he in Total Recall?
So he's the guy that has Quato in his stomach. Open your mind. So he's
amazing.
He's the human carrier of that.
He's the big brother.
Yes, that's exactly it. Yeah, but he's been in like a lot of other things too. Like he was like a hitman in Twins. So that's the Arnie kind of thing, kind of kicking
carrying through there.
Yeah. And a bunch of other stuff, which I'm not going to kind of go into too much detail. He's just got he tends to be like one of those support players, and one of those faces. You just go, I know that dude. And while I'm thinking of it too, the guy that plays, mind blank now. Was it Grady? Sorry, yeah. The guy that plays Grady is a guy called Robert Russler, or Russler. I presume that's how you pronounce his surname. And for me, he's been in a lot of things too. But for me, he will always be AJ from Vamp. I don't know if you've ever seen that film, Oscar, or not.
No, I have not had the, I'm guessing, pleasure.
Yeah. It's one of those. I mean, I say that, and it's probably one of those movies where you go back and go, what the hell did I ever see in that film? But it's basically Grace Jones is a vampiress in it. And he plays one of two kind of high school kind of geeks, guys who kind of stumble in on this kind of downtown kind of like exotic kind of strip bar essentially, but it's a bit more than is made up for it behind the scenes than it appears to be. And it's a comedy horror. It's not, so it's very much tongue in cheek, but it was one of those, just one of those films that really stuck with me as a kid. I loved it. And so he will always be AJ in my mind. Excuse me. So anyway, as I said, so the coach, going back to the film, so the coach kind of detains them afterwards and kind of gets them to stay behind. And that's kind of where they start hitting it off in more ways than one. But the what was I going to say with that? Sorry, mind gone blank. Then we cut to Lisa, the girl. So she goes to visit Jesse after school, and this is where they discover. This is at his place, isn't it? Where they discovered Nancy's diary or notes,
yes,
something like that.
It's her little journal as they're kind of clearing through the room.
Yes. Why she would leave that behind?
Well, I mean, her mother died. She was obviously distraught.
Dramatic. So
she had to get out of there. I find the way. I really kind of find a lot of enjoyment in the way that this movie links to the first one.
Okay.
Like it's not like great by any stretch of the means, but I love the kind of hokey kind of playing with the cliche of them kind of discovering this journal.
Yes.
And finding out the kind of the dangers ahead from that, you know, they start reading it, and it kind of gives a kind of sexiness to the first one that wasn't quite there. As we're reading about Nancy writing about her thinking about her boyfriend's body, and
yes,
and they flick a few pages, and you know, she reads that he's coming for me at night and with his claws, and Jesse has that moment of recognition of
who she's referring to,
of Freddy, who was on that bus with with his claws.
Yes.
Which is it's probably one of all of the stuff with his girlfriend, Lisa.
Yes.
Is probably, there's not a whole lot there. She's kind of just off on her own world. And to be fair, it's not about her.
No, it's not.
In the slightest.
No, it's not.
As we go along, it's like, it's all about him and this man who wants to be inside of him, as one of the lines of the actual movie.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
He's got because it's not long after that we go into the second dream of the movie.
Yes, that's right. Yes. Yeah.
You get that little...
Is that where the fires are happening? Is that the...
This is the second dream is where he goes outside, he looks down into the basement and sees Freddy sort of starting the boiler down there. Not the boiler, but the furnace.
Yes.
And it's him kind of starting those fires as they come and meet each other in the room, and he says
that's right. Yeah.
Basically he wants him, you know.
Yeah.
He wants him and Jesse's got the body and Freddy's got the brains. And there's this great shot of Freddy. Freddy is so gooey in this movie.
He really is. Yes.
He's just covered in goo, and there's this great shot that I'm trying to think about what it reminds me of, where you just see sort of just his eyes, just these like awful like demonic eyes, and the rest of him's in shadow. It's almost like kind of like Jeepers Creepers-ish.
Yes.
With Morticia from the Addams Family, with the way that she's always lit.
Yes, I know.
He rips off the top of his head and has his pulsating brain, which I think this is like, even though I think the Dream Warriors is kind of the one that really like cemented him as a pun maker.
Yes, that's right.
With I mean, it's right here, you know.
Yeah.
It's you can't take it out of him.
No, that's right. And you're right. This is the two kind of sets the path up for the comedy element that comes in with Freddy. Whereas Nightmare on Elm Street, the first film was always really sinister and eerie with the horror element of it. Whereas this adds the camp factor that Freddy would then become synonymous for, as you said. Yeah.
Well, but it's still not really him. Like in these first two, the comedy that comes from Freddy is always is a toying. It's of a sinister nature. He's just toying with his food.
Yeah.
And this one, there's like, I think everything else, like there's more lighthearted comedy with all of the other characters. But Freddy is still very you know, gooey.
Yeah, he's gooey. There's an organic
viscousy
features.
Yeah,
that's right. So you're right. So he appears and he's kind of enticing him, and then we have those, you know, the small fires that kind of occur. You know, the toaster goes off at one point and things like that, and then basically there's a bit with the birds as well. There's those two birds that kind of fly.
Two little lovebirds that one destroys the other and then flies up and then explodes in flames and feathers.
And then there's the dad having to go at the Jesse.
It's the cheap seed they've been getting. It must be.
Yeah, that's right. What do you mean? So very weird. And then it's like the next evening, I think, from memory, and then we get Jesse kind of coming face to face with Freddy again, and that's where
we get the wonderful melting imagery, like like Dali's melting clocks. There's like a vinyl on a thing, and it's just bending, and everything's melting, and like an element that is kind of solely in this one that like it's hot, like Freddy brings hell with him. Which is such a great element. Like I think there's such like cool things in this movie that Wes Craven is like no. He kind of reestablishes the kind of what he wants the rest of them to be in the next film. Whereas these guys are just they're taking what was set up and like that basic idea of a man who kills you in your dreams. And change it because Freddy isn't strong enough to do it. He's not doing it himself.
No.
Which is cool because that shows that he was defeated in the last movie.
Yeah.
That he isn't strong enough, so he needs Jesse to do it for him.
That's right.
Yeah. To get this kind of seduction, it's infestation.
Yeah. That's a good word.
And Jesse looks so weak in the beginning of this movie, and he kind of gets bolder and bolder. Kind of his hair gets kind of sharper.
Yes.
As he comes more and more into this kind of possession by Freddy. As he like looks down in I think that dream, and Freddy tells him to try the glove on.
Yes.
And he's always waking up screaming, dripping in sweat.
Yes. These wet dreams. Hey.
Always. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's right. Yeah, absolutely. And so this kind of like leads that it gets intense, doesn't it? Really intense. His dreams, and he becomes. He kind of tries different ways of trying to kind of keep awake, and he starts kind of wandering around at night, aimlessly through the streets.
Which, when I first saw this scene, I thought the whole thing was a dream.
Yeah,
he's walking through the night, and it's raining, and he ends up in this S&M bar.
Yes, and the coach there. Yeah,
and the coach grabs him by the arm, and we cut straight to the gymnasium, and he's running laps. And the coach is standing there in his leather chaps, and you're like, this is such a weird dream. And you slowly realize, like, I don't think this is a dream. He tells him to hit the showers, so they're kind of playing a
role play, don't they?
Yeah, they're doing role play.
Yeah.
The coach goes into his office and starts, pulling out like skipping ropes that he's planning on using, and balls start flying off the shelves and hitting him in the face.
Yes.
And this is like one of the things that I really love about this movie is just how it is like probably the gayest 80s horror movie that I've ever seen. And it's I've always heard that that it was subtextual. Yes. Until I watched the movie, and I was kind of blown back by like, there's no subtext. This is like very cool. It's really cool watching because as we were talking about how Jesse has become the main lead in this, opposed to like say a Nancy character.
Yeah,
and it's a lot of the men who are all being sexualized in this.
Yes.
They're all kind of and the women, it's like it's a particularly chaste film between like men and women.
Yes.
Yes. Whereas Grady, when he tackles Jesse, they almost get each other's pants off.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
As and then they're hanging around half naked in the locker room.
Yeah.
And it's all of like the classic. Like what that would all of be the like the tits and ass shots of like any other slasher movie of like the girls in the locker room, and
that's right,
getting all of like the skin flick points in.
It's so funny. I can't remember what doco I watched on this. It was a long time ago, where, and I'm pretty sure it was the director, so Jack Shoulder, and I want to say that the writer, David Chaskin, I think they were the ones in the interview, and they were just saying like exactly what you said, like they were going for a subtext with this, and they didn't actually realize how blatant they were being. And it is like when you're watching it, you're just like, how can you think this was subtle? It's very in your face and obvious, but there you go. Like, you know, they were obviously blinded by what they were trying to do and not realizing how it was very much up front.
I can kind of imagine that it would have gotten probably past people who wouldn't have been who wouldn't have seen like a more kind of gay-centric story. As I meant, like, because this is smack bang in the, you know, in the 80s. This is
right in the middle.
Not only is this like kind of a coming out story, and like a repression of like stuff inside, but you know, you've got elements of AIDS and like Freddy is kind of like AIDS, and
yes, that's right.
I find it's so interesting to watch, especially in the context, because nothing else got made like this at the time.
No, that's right.
It was all so like so kind of straight centric, female objectification, and I feel like it carries the torch over from the first one, where Nancy wasn't sexualized.
No,
she was incredibly capable and intelligent, and it's just kind of the other side of that kind of more kind of positive push in just a way that wasn't being told at the time. And in this scene where they're in the showers and the tight ropes come whipping to life and drag the coach down and tie him up, and his clothes are ripped off. I don't think I've ever seen another movie where a man's ass close up has been continuously whipped by a towel.
Yes.
It's at that moment where you're like, wow, like this was a Hollywood movie in the 80s. Like, that's wild. Before he's the room fills with steam, and Jesse is kind of obscured, and out steps Freddy as he slashes down his back, and then we see that Jesse's standing there with his bloodied glove.
That's right.
Still thinking he's in a dream.
Yes.
He's horrified, but he's not horrified in a sense that he knows the reality of what he's done. And as the viewer, we don't even really know whether we're in a dream still.
Yes. That's right. Yeah. And then in that respects, it kind of plays this particular scene really well, because that is reminiscent of the first film, where you are that the lines do blur between kind of dream and reality, and this particular sequence does do that. You know, and like even like when we straight after the scene, he's kind of picked up by the police, and he's kind of like walking around naked.
He's just wandering around naked on the highway.
That's right. And like, so like even that's kind of like, you kind of go, oh, was he daydreaming? Like, you know, or sleepwalking? You know, what's happening here? You know, because we already aware that he's having these vivid dreams.
And with the last dream, there was the element of sleepwalking, where he ended up down in the basement with the glove in his hand.
Yes, that's right.
Because that's where it was left by Nancy's mum, was in the boiler downstairs.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Exactly right. And so the parents naturally start getting a bit concerned about their son, you know, thinking he's unhinged, and potentially on drugs or something. And then randomly Lisa turns back up, and she takes Jesse to this kind of
Yeah.
I don't know what it was. It was like
It used to be a
building.
Yeah, it was a big refinery or
yeah,
something like that, because she tells him she's been researching.
Yes.
Because whenever she pops up, she's, there's something else that she's done.
Yeah, I've been
she's done all of this. Yeah, exactly. Pulls newspaper articles. Figured out where Freddy worked and the boiler that was mentioned. It's all of this stuff that would like a main character would do.
Yeah.
Of just kind of digging into the past, whereas like they're not interested in that. That's not the story they're telling. That's the story of last time. We've already gotten kind of gotten that, which is I think the highest praises I can give this film is that it does not repeat the first movie.
No, it doesn't. Yeah.
Which people hold it as a kind of a fault, but I think it's refreshing, especially because I saw this last.
Yes. Yeah, true. Yeah, okay. I get where you're coming from there. Yeah.
After watching 4 and 5 and 6, and it's very much like, oh, okay, cool. This is such a fork in the road.
Yeah. Yes.
It's like a little cul-de-sac that it could have continued down.
Yeah.
But it didn't.
It didn't.
And who knows what the world would have been like if Wes Craven never came back to it.
Yeah. That's true. We could be looking at a very different Freddy slasher series. Yeah. So with the plot then, so like we then pick up. I guess it's generally the next kind of big section of the movie is all centered around this kind of pool party sequence. At Lisa's house, I want to say.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a bit of a sort of a romantic kind of moment between Jesse and Lisa, where she's
pushing it. Yeah,
she's the one leading it, for sure.
As they kind of get down on the ground together, and they she has her shirt partially open. He's kind of kissing her chest, but don't see, her breasts aren't exposed. It's all very kind of, which all kind of feeds in whereas the most sexualization is all like the coach's butt. And,
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
All this kind of stuff. And he gets Freddy's tongue coming out of his mouth.
Yes. Oh, yeah, that's such a great moment. And then he starts panicking because his body's kind of changing, and he's like, so he, in the panic, he kind of leaves her, and he goes straight to Grady's house, and which in and of itself is interesting. And Grady actually points that out to him. But yeah, he basically confesses that he was the one that killed the coach. And he said he's really kind of worried that this stuff is happening in his sleep. And he kind of he wants Grady to watch him as he sleeps. So this is kind of basically what Nancy had asked Johnny Depp's character to do. The first one. And kind of, to stop him in case he leaves. So like he's got this real thing that he thinks is sleepwalking, and he's doing these things in his sleep. But it's actually Grady that falls asleep. And so then Freddy basically comes out of Jesse's body
in the best kind of special effects sequence of the movie. Where Jesse's fingers, the blades are pushing through his fingers and peeling away, and he has his mouth open, and inside you can see Freddy's eye looking around.
That's right. Yes.
As he just peels, as Freddy just kind of walks out of him like a shell.
Yes.
The husk of Jesse just kind of hits the ground.
Yes.
And Grady kind of sees Freddy standing in all his glory.
Yeah.
In all his goopy glory.
Loopy, gooey glory, yes. Yeah, and this is where then Freddy then attacks Grady and completely slaughters him. And we get is it the parents outside that are knocking on the door of Grady? I think it is.
Yeah, because he can't get through the door.
No.
Freddy has a bit more kind of like he's got more power in the real world. He's able to kind of a little bit more like telepathy. He's able to move things. He's able to close doors. He's able
That's right. Yeah.
Lock gates and move bits and pieces. It's definitely a very loose like power set where you're like,
yes,
I don't know what's happening with this guy. Like what he can do, and it's all just like nightmarish.
Yes.
Like waking nightmare.
Yeah, that's right. And then this is like a pretty kind of like brutal scene as well. So like basically Freddy ends up killing Grady, and then we get the shot of Jesse kind of realizing what's happened. Once Freddy changes back to Jesse, and he kind of sees Freddy in the mirror, doesn't he? Kind of laughing back at him, and then this is where Grady decides that not Grady, Jesse does a runner from Grady's house. We then cut back to Lisa's house where the pool party's going on, and Jesse turns out basically kind of now he confides in Lisa, and
he's covered in blood.
He's covered, absolutely covered in blood, but somehow she believes him.
Yeah, well, I mean, she's been researching this whole time. She knows something.
Why are you
Freddy?
I've done a bit more research,
a bit more digging.
Yeah, free Google. So I've pulled out the huge encyclopedia on Freddy Krueger, and I've discovered these stuff about him. So she kind of believes that his story, and she kind of is the one that basically says, "You're the one giving him strength. You are feeding Freddy, and if he stops being afraid of Freddy, he can get his power back and stop Freddy from coming through." This is where he starts to transform, though, doesn't he? Again, and he basically tries to attack Lisa.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we get a kind of a more classic kind of throwback to Nancy and Freddy of her kind of skittering away, and him sort of Robert Englund's doing his wonderful Freddy run.
Yeah.
And he kind of she loses him at a moment.
Yes,
and we see the gate lock.
Yes.
Outside, and the grill starts burning.
Yes.
And the water starts getting hot.
Yeah.
People start kind of like running out, and then we get Freddy bursting out of like from the like veranda, exploding out of the ground and freaking out a whole party. This is interesting. This is such an interesting scene because he has them all trapped and he's just toying with all of them now. And he kills sort of like a few here and there.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
people get trampled as they're like trying to climb the fence to get away from him. And the Lisa's dad comes running out with a shotgun and misses.
Yeah, that's right.
He has his little flame.
That's right, but she stops him because she knows that that's not Freddy. It's Jesse, and
yes.
So she basically stops the dad from shooting him. But this is one. I think this is one of the scenes that's come under quite a lot of scrutiny because this is where it really breaks the rules from the original because Freddy makes his appearance known before all of them. and it's an outdoor scene. His entity. The whole point of Freddy was that he would stalk them one by one and hone in on their fears. And this is just him kind of blatantly going rampant in a very kind of public space. So
very, very a lot more Jason, a lot more. More so Jason than any of the others.
Yes.
Where it is weird. I remember the first time watching this scene being like, "Whoa, what's happening?"
Yeah.
This is so strange. And I meant like the metaphors in the whole film don't. The movie doesn't hold. It's not watertight by
it really
any
isn't.
Stretch.
It really
by
isn't.
any stretch at all.
Yeah.
But it's I meant what I am most disappointed about with this scene is that the water doesn't boil anyone alive.
No.
The pool kind of starts bubbling and people are obviously getting out because it's hot. But I wish people were like getting out and were as burned as he was. That's my kind of
I'm with you on that.
Disappointment.
Yeah. 100%.
Push the fire to the extreme because it's just gotten hotter and hotter and hotter throughout the whole movie.
Yes.
And he's brought the heat, but he runs off and escapes.
Yes, he does. Freddy does. Yeah, that's all. Freddy, Jesse kind of escape the scenario. And he, Lisa then kind of goes in pursuit of Jesse, goes to the that previous scene.
She knows the refinery. She's like, done all her research.
And basically kind of is persuading Jesse to confront his fear.
Before they come face to face, as she's walking through the gates, there are two dogs with people faces.
Oh, yeah.
It's a one-shot thing, but she walks past these like guard dogs that have human faces.
Yes.
Which is just another element, which was another moment of being like, yes, like that's so weird. That's so dreamlike of being like, and there were these dogs, but they had people faces, and it was my house, but it wasn't my house. It's a whole lot of that as she kind of goes in and, they don't attack her or anything. They're just table dressing.
Yes, that's right. That's right. So she, as you said, she enters the actual refinery or whatever it is, and that's where their final confrontation with Freddy begins. She basically is pleading with Jesse just to kind of confront Freddy, but he's kind of saying that Freddy's just too strong. She confesses her love to Jesse, and then we get her kissing Freddy moment.
Yep.
And at this point, Jesse starts to kind of awaken a little bit within himself. And out of that, Freddy then kind of bursts into flames or turns into ash, and Jesse kind of is born again.
Very Ghostbusters.
Yes.
Very kind of breaking out of the shells.
That's right.
The crispy shells.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right. Someone go help that little guy. So he's so he kind of has been in this cocoon. This is is this his coming out? And then we cut to later on. So we're kind of presuming that Freddy's destroyed at this point.
It's their happy triumph.
Yeah.
They get to hold each other. It's like this is like the Hollywood. This is, I think, what the writer would have been like. This will help get it through.
Yeah.
This will help get the rest of the movie through. Yeah. They're happily, the boy gets the girl, which is what the movie's always been about.
Yeah, of course. That's nice. Wink, wink. So that's right. So they have that kind of happy moment. Then we get this kind of the conclusion, which again a bit similar to first film. In this instance, they're in that school bus from the first scene. We've got Jesse with.
He says goodbye to his mum. He's got bandages up both of his arms.
Yes,
which is like very. I mean, the first thing I think about of that is like suicide bandages.
Yes,
him of having his wrists covered up as he kind of waves, and he's waving his arms. He's all incredibly happy, jumping on the bus. Sees his girlfriend Lisa, and they sit next to each other. And
that's right.
All very happily moving along.
That's right. And sorry, I'm going to cough. Sorry. then we get the kind of girl, the best friend kind of character girl called Kerry, who's sitting behind them, and they're kind of having that kind of moment, and then all of a sudden, the claw comes bursting through her chest. Through her chest, was very alien.
Very alien. Really like Friday the 13th.
Yeah.
Like Jason coming out of the water at the end of that movie just forever changed.
Yes.
How you end a slasher movie.
Yes, that's right.
The final jump, the final, the final like franchise builder.
Yes.
You can tell whatever story you want, and then you just put it on at the end. It's just they're still alive.
So and then we hear basically like Freddy laughing as the bus then kind of goes off into that kind of field again, like from
again, it drives straight off the road.
It's hilarious.
It's so funny.
And that's the end of the film. So, but interestingly, on that note, though, like for me, like so, if we're looking at like the kind of obviously the homoerotic kind of scenes that kind of are at the core of this film. For me, I read this as like he hasn't properly come out. Like he's still in the closet because he's living this kind of fake like fantasy lifestyle of what people should expect him to be with Lisa, and because of
the Hollywood story.
Yeah, that's exactly that. And because he's willing to go along with that dream. He's not actually facing up to his own reality of who he is inside, and because of that, deep down, Freddy's always going to continue to haunt him. I don't know whether I'm going a bit too deep with that, but that's on.
No, I think it's all there.
Yeah,
I think this is probably has the most of like the most to read.
Yeah,
out of many of them.
Yeah. I agree.
Where you can really kind of like rip into it because it's I mean, I joked that it wasn't subtext, but there is so much there. Of different elements that you can pull from such a like interesting time in Hollywood.
Yes, very much so. Yeah. So before I kind of we kind of round up our thoughts on this. A couple of things I've just kind of put here is we've spoken about obviously the homoerotic stuff, but along with that, this is really there's a lot of psychosexual aspects that this is charged with throughout it, all the imagery and stuff that's used throughout, and more so as you quite rightly point out in comparison to the first film, and the other parts of it is that. The focus isn't on necessarily on Freddy himself, but the impact he has on the characters, which is very different this time around. And obviously, there are daylight scenes where the horror kind of comes in as well, which kind of breaks to the tradition from the original film. And also that they kind of bring Freddy out of the dream world into the real world a lot more in this film. And so let's just put a pin on those kind of few little rambles for a moment, because the other thing before I come back to that, the other thing I do want to mention is makeup artist, because you did mention about how he's a lot of my kind of oozy and that kind of dripping kind of set from compared to the original film. The makeup artist is a guy called Kevin Yeager. Now he would come back to do Freddy again in the Dream Master and the Dream Warriors, before that. And the spin-off, TV series, Freddy's Nightmares. So he was very much in control of the look of Freddy. And I'll mention some of his other stuff in a tick. But like on the Freddy note, his approach to creating Freddy is that he wanted to look at him as a bit of a male witch. So he kind of looked at the crooked nose and the pointy chin kind of from the old kind of view of what a horror witch would look like, and then toned it down a bit, and then kind of made him look a bit more pussy and burnt. He was looking for that kind of. He went through looking at burn victims essentially to kind of get the look, and that's why he got that kind of real dripping kind of look, because he said like you get the skin kind of melts on these burn victims, and that's what he was trying to go for. And yeah, like it's like the makeup in this is probably one of the more kind of stunning moments of the film. And so just to kind of mention a couple of his other movies, he was in Honey, I Blew Up the Kid. He was in he did the makeup. All this is makeup stuff. So he looked after the crypt keeper in Bordello of Blood. And things like that. So, and he did one of the Hellraiser movies, and looked at Lemony Snicket's series of unfortunate events from more recent. I'm talking about the Jim Carrey kind of film,
right? Version
of that. He did the Spiderwick Chronicles. I'm kind of jumping through really, really quickly. So he's still in the scene, as it were, doing kind of stuff, quite active. But yeah. Obviously, he was kind of integral to the look of Freddy, first and foremost. So coming back to what I was saying about the differences between this one and the previous film. So something that often that we've discussed in the Surgeons of Horror team is that in order to be a successful sequel, you need to have it needs to have the same rules from the original, but with something added to it that kind of gives it its own entity in its own right. And we always use, I say we, Ant and I, who from the podcast team, always use the Aliens example, where Jimmy Cameron, brought in the same rules that was applied for Alien, but kind of obviously rather than making it a horror film, it was an action film, and he threw in the Queen kind of character within that, so kind of made it more of a hive kind of thing, which kind of added to the folklore that was behind the Xenomorphs. So for us, that's an example of a great sequel. With that in mind, where would you look at this film, like in as part of the franchise canon, when you ignore what comes next?
I would say that this film, if it dominated what came next, I think it's interesting particularly with where Nightmare went.
Yes.
With this kind of focus, like it almost could have, like this could have taken it on like a lot less kind of real based. It could have gone a lot more surreal, a lot more kind of real, kind of crazy matte painting. Like it could have become like more fantasy, than horror. And I think for this film, it's like a not great. It's a okay sequel, bordering on bad, but not unenjoyable.
No.
Sequel to the original. Like it's not good. It kind of throws a lot of things out the window. It just kind of takes some of it feels like a very different entity, even though a lot of the elements like it is a linear sequel. Like all the actions of this, they're the next people who live in the house, and
yes, that's right.
You know, the glove is where it was left, and Nancy has this element, and it feels like the kind of sequel where you can't afford the stars of the original. Where you're like, well, here's a book by someone called, you know.
Yeah. Very much so. Very much so.
Where they've just kind of like written off, and it feels, it's a lot more uneven.
Yeah.
But even in saying all of that, I enjoyed for both times that I've watched it, I'm just like, I enjoy how weird it is.
Yeah.
I think it's the weirdest of the lot.
Okay.
Which, and some of that comes from its unevenness.
Yes.
Where it is got such kind of, it takes real strong swings, and it is kind of really talking about something.
Yeah.
Which all of them that aren't driven by Wes, I think aren't really.
Yeah.
They're just kind of riffing on what was successful and what was popular, and this kind of feels like it feels weird. It feels outside the studio system.
Yes.
It feels like it slipped through the net, and I love that about it. I love how kind of rebellious it feels.
Yeah.
Especially with, you know, I mean, looking at, say, like Halloween and Friday the 13th and those other kind of like 80s slasher films, and seeing where all of they went with their sequel and their follow-up. And this is like, you know, like Halloween has its detriments to just doing the same.
Yeah.
Basically the same thing, and Friday the 13th is when you bring Jason in, like that's kind of golden.
Yeah.
That kind of like surpasses the first and dominates itself. And this one is almost in between the two.
Yeah.
Where it's breaking kind of new ground, but it hasn't built a strong enough lore and its kind of own logic. It's not really interested in that.
Yeah.
But it feels like something you could have made a sequel to, like that would have been standalone. Like it's just a group of people who Freddy comes in and he fucks around, and there's crazy dream stuff, which is, you know, basically what we get.
Yeah.
But I find it to be a really interesting movie.
Yeah. So look, I mean, and you're right. You're tapping on quite a lot of things there that kind of make it stand out in its own right. And it has since become a cult classic in its own way because of those moments that you're talking about. With that in mind, like would you recommend this movie to anyone? And I guess why would you recommend it if you would?
I would recommend it. I'd recommend it for the dream stuff, but I think primarily the homoerotic nature of the whole thing.
Yeah,
I think that's the most interesting thing about the whole movie.
Yes,
and that makes it stand out from a lot of stuff. And when I first saw it, I was just kind of blown away.
Yeah.
with how like rich it was with that material, because it's I feel like so much of like mainstream Hollywood and with all of these movies, it's so kind of for the most part male gaze centric.
Yes.
And I mean this is as well, but gazing at something else that isn't, you know, big bosomed women running away from a man with a knife.
It would have been really interesting to see a bit more of a gay homoerotic kind of slasher franchise, I guess, in that sense. And, you know, maybe it was a bit before its time. Will we ever see something like that again? I don't know. Possibly. But yeah, very, very interesting. And it could have been, like you said, the whole franchise could have been something incredibly different. And do you think, like, we're talking like now it's over 35 odd years, or roughly about that now. Do you think it stands the test of time? Does it feel dated? Do you think it still has something to say?
I think it is dated. I think it's very dated. Yeah. In a good way, in a good, in a way that kind of plonks it in that time. And I think the datedness, not even talking about its messaging, but talking about, like the there's one particular scene where he's cleaning his room and he's like bumping his butt, closing drawers and like putting glasses on, and like he pops a popper where he's holding it in front of his crotch, and like that's very 80s, like that thing is very 80s, and it's very gay, and and like the girl walks in, it's like it feeds into that whole thing. And I think the messaging in the movie is interesting because it really does place it in the 80s. It really places it kind of amidst the AIDS epidemic and the kind of the fear that a lot of people had about being out and proud, and this kind of repression, and how and representing how dangerous it was. And even though I don't think, we don't live in that same world, there is still a lot of communities where that is kind of prevalent, and there are kind of people who don't know who they are and repress elements within them, not even just homosexual urges or tendencies, but just like you can talk about it. It's like it's like the X-Men. The X-Men are about civil rights and gay rights, and it's about presenting who you are. And I think that's a powerful message, and it's not a prestige movie with a powerful message, but it's talking about this stuff, and that's I think that's going to be worth a recommend for me.
I agree with you there. I do agree with you there, Oscar, and I think that's what it's exactly the kind of movie that it is that makes it stand out, and because it stands out, it makes it and actually an important film of its time. And it's just weird that it happens to kind of live and breathe within a franchise that would then go on to be something else. Very much so. Cool, man. Well, I think on that note, we probably can bow out on our discussions on Freddy's Revenge. And I should probably say that I would definitely recommend it too, on that note as well. But it was the second installment, and do stick around for further of our franchise discussions on A Nightmare on Elm Street, and where they actually did take the rest of the franchise in upcoming podcasts. Let us know your thoughts on Freddy's Revenge and how you feel it fits within the franchise as a whole. Send us messages on our social streams, and let us know if you do believe it deserves to be a cult classic or not. Until then, I'm your host for the podcast series. My name is Saul Muerte, and I was joined by Oscar Jack. Thank you. Goodbye.
See you next time.
You're listening to the Surgeons of Horror podcast. Music supplied by Peter Nezik. For more discussions or podcasts, head over to surgeonsofhorror.com or head over to our Facebook and Twitter sites for the latest news and updates.